Hey YouTube, how's it going? Thanks for joining us here for our Week 15 Start Sit video. Of course, as first we want to just say is congratulations if you're still in it, if you still have a chance of winning the championship. That's always nice, but the pressure is definitely on. One thing that we're going to do this video is we're going to give lots of in-depth information on the players we're talking about, but we're not going to talk about a ton of players because, well, a lot of these guys just don't have enough value to be worth playing at this point in the season. For example, I have Carolina. I'm not going to talk about 5 different Carolina wide receivers. Most of them don't have any value. So we're just going to put that out there. However, sometimes you make it to the championship or you make it in the playoffs, you get far, and sometimes you do that with a lot of not great players by streaming at some positions. That happens. If that's the case and there's a player you want to know about but we didn't talk about, of course, just leave a comment down below and we will answer it with as much in-depth information as we can find. I guess that's pretty much all I have to mention before we start, except for that, remember, keep an eye out for our playoff contest video. We're going to release that with all of the details on everything that we're going to be doing. It should be lots of fun and extend your fantasy season into the playoffs basically through February, so that'll be lots of fun to do. Guys, let's just get right into it, into the first game.
So let's look at the first game here, the Chiefs versus the Chargers. This should be a fun game to watch. Reminds me very much of the Chiefs versus the Rams on Thursday night. This should be a very high-scoring game. I'd like to start with quarterbacks Pat Mahomes. He's playing the Chargers, allowing the third fewest points to quarterbacks there. Now, this looks on paper like a tough matchup. Now, in his worst game this year, Pat Mahomes faced the Jags. But even in his worst matchup, he still scored 17.82 points in that game. He still threw for 313 yards and had a rushing touchdown. On the year, he's averaging 330 passing yards per game and over 3 touchdown passes per game. This guy's matchup proof. He's been amazing. You got to start this guy. Don't get cute come playoff time. I know on paper it looks like it might be a tougher matchup. It doesn't matter. Pat Mahomes, start him in this one. Let's move on to Philip Rivers. So Kansas City is the 28th defense in the NFL. They allow 27 points per game, but they're number 1 in scoring 36 points per game. That's a perfect storm for what should make a high-scoring game. This one, the over-under is going to be really high in this. And then you look at Rivers. He's going to have to throw the ball a lot. So if you're a Rivers owner, that bodes well for you. And you're playing Kansas City, allows the second most points to quarterbacks. Philip Rivers is having a great season. Right now, he's got his best quarterback rating ever of his career, 114.5. He's on pace for 36 touchdown passes. So start Philip Rivers once again. Pat Mahomes, Philip Rivers, they are must-starts in this game. It should be a great game for both of those guys. Now going to the running backs. We'll start with the Chargers running back situation there. Melvin Gordon got in a limited practice yesterday. At this point, he traveled with the team and he sees a game-time decision. Now, if he ends up playing, you're going to have to start the guy. Now, I know that's kind of risky because you don't know how many carries he's going to get. What if he re-aggravates that injury? Who knows? But he's too good not to play. So if he suits up, you got to roll him out. And the reason why he plays Kansas City. Kansas City gives up the second most points to running backs there. But if for some reason Melvin Gordon doesn't go, that leaves Jackson and Eckler. Now, Eckler's probably going to be out in this game. He's in concussion protocol. Monday could barely move his neck. There's no way he's going to get cleared in time. That leaves Jackson in this one. Jackson's been solid this year. He's a little bit bigger back. He's more physical than Austin Eckler. He's got a 5.1 yards per carry, so he'll probably run the ball more effectively than Eckler, although he'll probably get a few less catches in the passing game. He's not quite as apt there in the passing game. I look at Jackson in this one. If Melvin Gordon sits, I would say Jackson's a running back too. You got to play him. As far as the Kansas City running back situation, you got Spencer Ware. Spencer Ware is looking doubtful for this game. He didn't practice. Right now, everything's trending towards him sitting. And that leaves Damian Williams. Now, Damian Williams faces the Chargers, who give the 14th most points to running backs. Now, if you look at Damian Williams, last 4 seasons he's been with the Dolphins. He wasn't a great running back per se, but he was very effective in the passing game. So I think he's a guy that in this matchup, I think he could be started as a running back 2 or 3, depending upon your league size and scoring system. I like him better in PPR leagues. Once again, he's been pretty effective in the passing game, not quite as effective in the running game. But in this offense, you got to start this guy. Last week in this offense, he had 2 touchdowns. So Damian Williams is the guy to look for Thursday night. As far as wide receivers go, I will look at talk about Keenan Allen. Playing Kansas City, give him the 14th most points to wide receivers. Now, last season, Keenan Allen blew up after week 9, and it looks like he's done the same thing again. If you look, he's got touchdowns 5 weeks in a row. During that same stretch, he's averaging 95 receiving yards per game, had 8 catches per game, starting him as a wide receiver 1. Now also look at Mike Williams and Tyrell Williams. Well, if you look at both of those guys, Tyrell had 2 games earlier this year that he was huge and he exploded. But even during those 2 games, we kind of cautioned and said it was concerning that his snap count and his targets weren't high enough. They were too low to trust this guy, and sure enough, he's disappointed 6 weeks in a row. During those 6 weeks when he has played, he's only averaging 2.4 catches per game and 23 yards per game. He's touchdown dependent, and therefore I would sit Tyrell. Now look at Mike Williams. Mike Williams is a former first-round pick who's got 7 touchdowns on the year. I think he's a sleeper play this week. Now, I assume this is going to be a higher scoring game. They'll have to throw the ball a lot there, and he could be a sneaky play, although he's kind of a sleeper, but I wouldn't call him a lock to perform. He's more of a wide receiver 3 or 4. Once again, if you're in a really large league, maybe 14 or 16 teams, Mike Williams is a guy that I would trust probably as a wide receiver 3. Now let's look at Tyreek Hill. Playing the Chargers. Now the Chargers allow these 7th fewest points to wide receivers. He has a tough matchup. He's going to face a very good corner in Hayward. With that said, he's having an excellent season, and he's a must-start. The fact that he faces Hayward probably puts him more down to a wide receiver 2, but you'd be foolish not to start this guy. And then there's Sammy Watkins. Now, Kansas City Stars Sam Mellinger reports Sammy Watkins experienced a setback and will be sidelined 4 to 6 weeks, so it sounds like he's going to be out for a while. That leaves Robinson and Conley as the 2 other wide receivers to look towards. So for me, the one that I would probably say that you could probably trust the most would be Conley. He has the most value, but it's hard to trust him. With Hill and Kelsey getting the targets in the running game, he's a borderline wide receiver 3 or 4 in deep leagues. And when I say deep leagues, teams 12 teams or larger would be maybe what we call deeper league, larger than 12 teams. In those, I would say Conley in this matchup is a wide receiver 3. If you're in a smaller league, I would probably sit those guys. As far as tight ends go, you got Antonio Gates versus Kansas City. Kansas City gives up the 2nd most points to tight ends there, but Gates simply can't be trusted. He's not the Antonio Gates of old. He's not getting the targets there. I would sit him. And then there's Travis Kelce. He's leading fantasy tight ends in average scoring per week. This guy's a stud. He's a must-start. Doesn't matter who he faces. And Kansas City give up the 14th fewest points to tight ends. Does it really matter? You're going to start Travis Kelce. That's kind of a no-brainer. Both kickers in this game, great start. Start both kickers, and I would sit both defenses.
All right, here we come to the Texans-Jets game. As far as Deshaun Watson goes, the Jets give up the 16th fewest points to quarterbacks. He's honestly not a great option. He's averaging just 1.4 touchdowns per game over the last 5 games. Only once all season has he thrown for more than 2 touchdowns. And on top of that, last week he had a pretty good week, but he was forced to throw the ball 38 times, something that he really hasn't been forced to do much this season. And so I don't think that he's a great matchup simply because they're playing him very efficiently but very conservatively. On the other side, Sam Darnold, guys, you know I'm going to say don't start him. Texans give up the 12th fewest points to quarterbacks. On top of that, the Texans have only given up an average of 12 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks over the last 10 games. So they are consistently shutting down or at least slowing down quarterbacks. And over the last 3 games, Darnold's 2 touchdowns to 7 interceptions has equated to only 9 fantasy points per game. He just hasn't been productive. As far as the running backs go, I like Lamar Miller. While the Jets give up the 12th fewest fantasy points to running backs, Miller has been very good. Now, the Jets' numbers are kind of deceiving because they haven't given up a lot of touchdowns, but they've given up a lot of yards. And so despite giving up the 12th fewest fantasy points to running backs, they're still the 27th ranked run defense in the NFL. And so that definitely bodes well for him. And on top of that, since week 7, he has scored a touchdown or ran over 100 yards in all but 1 game. So he's been very productive lately. I wouldn't quite call him a running back 1, but maybe a flex player, running back 2 for sure. Isaiah Crowell, the Houston Texans, give up the 9th fewest points to running backs, and he has not scored since week 6 or ran over 100 yards. On top of that, Houston has the 5th best run defense in the NFL right now, so you should not start Crowell. As far as the wide receivers go, guys, obviously you're going to start DeAndre Hopkins. The Jets give up the 4th most points to wide receivers, and he's got 9 touchdowns on the year, despite having a pretty tough schedule. In fact, he played Tennessee twice, very underrated defense, Jacksonville twice, a very good defense. On top of that, Washington, Dallas, Buffalo, and Denver, all very good defenses, especially when you compare how they look against wide receivers. And so he's been extremely productive. Now, wide receiver Kiki Kuti, he does have a good matchup this week. However, he's been struggling with a hamstring issue and missed his 8th game of the season last week. Honestly, it seems like a coin toss as to whether or not he's going to be playing every week. And for me, that says, can you really trust him? I'm not sure if you can. If he plays, maybe you can put him in at a wide receiver 3. As far as the final wide receiver on that Texans team, Demaryius Thomas, guys, he just doesn't have a lot of value. If Kiki Kuti does play, Thomas has 0 value. And even if he doesn't play, Thomas doesn't have a lot of value. He's only scored in 1 game since he came to the Houston Texans, and he just hasn't been a big part of that offense. So I'm not a huge fan of him this week. Really, the only Jets wide receiver worth mentioning would be Robbie Anderson, and it's only worth mentioning to say don't start him. The Texans give up the 10th fewest points to wide receivers, and since week 6, only one time has he scored, and only one time has he gone over 50 yards receiving. The production just has not been there. I think that Robbie Anderson's a talented wide receiver. I would say it's probably due to the rest of that offense and his quarterback, but still, nonetheless, the fantasy value is not there this week. Now we move on to the tight ends. Jordan Thomas. He's got a tough matchup against a team that gives the 8th fewest points to tight ends. On top of that, his best game this year was 10 fantasy points, which isn't great, and that was on 32 yards and a touchdown. Really, any player in the NFL can find a touchdown any week, and so when your best week is 32 yards receiving, I think that's a real bad indicator of your production. I don't think you should play Jordan Thomas. A guy that we've liked this year and we've been watching, hopefully he should have some more value next year, is Chris Herndon. While he does go against the Houston Texans, who give up the 6th most points to tight ends, the production has not been there. In fact, his production is even lower when Sam Darnold is the quarterback in that offense, and so I don't think that you should play him this week, despite the good matchup. As far as the kickers go, you absolutely have to start kicker. I'm probably going to say his first name wrong, Kaimi Fairbairn, something like that. He's got to be from another country, honestly.
Sounds like he's from Hawaii.
I think that's probably what it is. But anyways, he's got a good matchup. He's been a great kicker. I believe he has the 3rd most points amongst all kickers this season and goes up against a team that gives it the 9th most points to kickers. He is an absolute must start. On the other side, Jason Myers, you got to sit this guy. He hasn't had less than 5 fantasy points all season, so that's actually a pretty high floor, but goes against a team that gives it the 10th fewest points to kickers, and I simply don't trust that offense. I certainly do think that you should start the Texans defense. It's a good matchup, and they've been averaging over 10 fantasy points per game over the last 4 games, so I feel like they're a very consistent start with a good matchup. And then the Jets, you should sit the Jets. They're averaging just 4 fantasy points per game over the last 7 games, and the Texans give it the 12th fewest points to defenses.
Let's take a look at the Broncos versus the Browns. Start with quarterback Case Keenum versus the Browns, allowing the 17 fewest points to quarterbacks there. We talked about this offense. It's not a prolific offense, and it's really not intended to be. If you look at it, they want to play conservative. They want to play defense, run the ball with Lindsey, and have Case Keenum make a few high percentage throws, keep the turnovers down. That doesn't bode well. It doesn't create a good fantasy quarterback. If you look at the last 7 games, he only has 8 touchdown passes. His best wide receiver, Emmanuel Sanders, is out for the year. They trade away Demaryius Thomas. In the last 4 games, only averaging 185 passing yards and scoring 12.6 fantasy points. He's only really had 3 games this year he's been of fantasy worth, and so I would sit him at this point. Look elsewhere. Don't look to Case Keenum in your Week 15 playoff. Baker Mayfield faces Denver, giving up the 12 fewest points to quarterbacks. This quarterback, he's played well this season. It looks like he deserved the #1 overall draft pick. This guy's very good. He's got a bright future. The last 7 games, he's thrown 15 touchdown passes. He's been composed. He's been sharp. But he's playing in Denver. He's going to deal with road noise, cold, and Denver's in playoff contention. There's a lot of incentive for them to come out and play well in this one. That Denver defense currently is 5th in the NFL in interceptions and tied for 4th with the Bears for sacks. Chubb is getting better. Miller's great. That's an unstoppable rushing duo. Those guys can rush the quarterback and put pressure on. I think they're going to cause a lot of issues for Baker Mayfield. I like him. I think he's a quarterback that's trending upwards. I think he's got a great, bright future in the NFL. But I would advise sitting Baker Mayfield at this point. As far as the running backs go, I look at Philip Lindsay. The Browns allow the 6th most points to running backs there. Now, after killing it for 6 straight games, he struggled last game. He had 30 yards on 14 carries, although he did find the end zone. That gives him 8 touchdowns the last 7 games. I think he's going to rebound this week in terms of yards. I think he's a very solid play. I would start him as a low-end running back 1. As far as Royce Freeman goes, he looked better last week, but he hasn't done enough to trust. Sit Freeman. As far as Nick Chubb, playing Denver. Denver allows the 14th most points to running backs. We said it before, that Denver defense got torched early in the year for about a 3-game stretch. They give like 600 yards, but really they have made some improvements. That defense isn't quite as bad against the run as it would seem to indicate according to the numbers. But Nick Chubb is a real deal. This guy has looked really good. He's had a rushing touchdown 5 games in a row. Gives him 10 on the season and 8 in the last 7 games, just like Lindsey. He's had 8 touchdowns in the last 7 games. He's got a 5.3 yards per carry on the year, and he's very capable in the passing game. In fact, he's got 13 catches the last 4 games. I would start him as a very good running back too. As far as Duke Johnson goes, you got Chubb, who's developed quite a bit. He's getting more carries, more touches, targets. Duke Johnson is not somebody you should even consider starting at this point. I would sit him. As far as the wide receivers, Jarvis Landry, when I look at Jarvis Landry, I think about the term bipolar. So you think about the first 7 games, he looked solid, then he disappeared for 4 games. Now the last 2 games, he's become relevant again. He's been productive again. He's playing Denver, giving up the 15th fewest points to wide receivers, but cornerback Chris Harris is going to be out. So look at Jarvis Landry, and for me, he's a wide receiver 3. I want to come a wide receiver 2 in this matchup here, but just there's so many question marks. One, he's just been inconsistent. Baker Mayfield's a rookie. They're playing on the road, etc., etc. So for me, I got to bump him down to a wide receiver 3 in this matchup. As far as the wide receivers for Denver go, I'll start with Cortland Sutton. So he's headed out of practice Tuesday. He had an injury late in that game. He was able to play through it, although he had low numbers. I wonder how much those numbers were lowered due to the fact that he was injured. Looks like at this point, Denver's just managing his practice reps, and he'll be good to go come Saturday night. But if he does play, I still think he's a wide receiver 4. Even though the Browns do give up the 8th most points to wide receivers, I think this offense is conservative. It's hard to pin down clear targets. Looked like he was going to be the clear number 1 guy, and then of course Hamilton and Tim Patrick get targeted. Once again, it's just inconsistent. It's very hard to trust any of those guys, so for me, he's a wide receiver 4. If he sits for some reason, if he misses the game, look at Hamilton and Tim Patrick. I mentioned before that the Broncos are far from prolific there, and so they like to run the ball. They don't throw a lot. These are young wide receivers. Case has been inconsistent. None of these guys really, honestly, I would trust. If you're going to look towards a guy, the preferred play for me would be Hamilton, but he's still just a borderline wide receiver 3 or 4 based on league size and scoring. Once again, all those wide receivers carry a lot of question marks. I would probably try to avoid that wide receiver situation if you can afford to do that. As far as tight ends go, get David Njoku. Denver allows the 6th most points to tight ends. David has improved this season, and he looks like a player that next year is going to move into the top 10. This guy's got a lot of talent. He's got huge upside, but he's still developing. And because he's still developing, because Baker Mayfield's young, there's a lot of inconsistency there. So this is a guy that I think has a high ceiling in this game, but a very low floor. With that said, you need to start him, but he's going to be boom or bust. Sit the Denver tight ends. Neither kicker in this game is a great play. It's best to sit both kickers if you can afford to. I would sit the Bears defense, but I would start the Broncos defense.
All right, here we come to the Cardinals versus the Falcons. Now, Matt Ryan goes up against the Cardinals, who give the 4th fewest points to quarterbacks. On top of that, he's had less than 400 yards passing in the last 2 games combined, and the Cardinals give up only an average of 210 passing yards per game. I think you should sit Matt Ryan, or maybe if you're in a very large league, maybe a 16-team league, certainly you may have to play him, but I'm far from excited for him this week. Guys, let's all save some time and just agree to not play Josh Rosen, because that's the smart call right there. Not even smart, just the obvious call, I should say. As far as the running backs go, on the Atlanta side, Tevin Coleman. While the Cardinals do give the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs this season, I still don't think that you should play Tevin Coleman unless you have to. He's only exceeded 60 rushing yards twice all season. Last week he was outran by running back Ito Smith. I don't know if you guys all know who he is. And on top of that, over the last 3 weeks, he is averaging just 5 fantasy points per game. The production simply isn't there. On the other side, David Johnson. Now, Atlanta gives it the 4th most points to running backs, and that bodes very well for him. You certainly may play him, but he's only scored once since week 6 and is only averaging 62 rushing yards per game. Of course, he has added value in PPR leagues, and I know that in a lot of people who have him are going to find a way to put them in their lineup, but I would certainly look at the rest of your roster and see if you have some better options, of course, especially if you're in a standard league. But again, certainly many of you may be playing him either way. As far as the wide receivers go, you're absolutely going to start Julio Jones. Even though the Cardinals give up the 9th fewest points to wide receivers, how can you keep this guy out of your lineup? He has 5 touchdowns in the past 6 games, and he has topped 100 yards in 7 of the last 8 games. So he has just been very dominant. You got to play him. Calvin Ridley, on the other hand, I wouldn't play this week. He is very, very touchdown dependent. He's had just 32 yards receiving over the past 2 games combined. And of course, I've already mentioned multiple times how good that Cardinals pass defense is. You can't trust Calvin Ridley this week. On the other side, really the only wide receiver worth mentioning is Larry Fitzgerald, because Christian Kirk is out. Larry Fitzgerald has posted more than 55, or excuse me, has not posted more than 55 yards in any of the Cardinals' last 5 games, and the Atlanta defense has only given up, has only led a wide receiver top 51 yards just once in their last 5 games. So this is a very, very not friendly matchup for any of the wide receivers. I wouldn't start any Cardinals wideouts this week for sure. Now, Austin Hooper. Austin Hooper is currently marked as questionable. Of course, I think that he probably will play, but he should be a little bit banged up, and I don't think you should start him. Cardinals give up the 16th fewest points to tight ends, and the production hasn't been there for Austin Hooper like I think a lot of people were expecting at the beginning of this season. He has topped 50 yards only once in the past 7 games and only scored 2 touchdowns over that span. And again, the tough matchup and the injury problem is just going to be a lot of reasons for me to say probably don't start him. However, I do understand the tight end position is thin, so if you think you need to start him, leave a comment down below. We'll talk about it and we'll look at some of your other options. Ricky Seals-Jones should be benched. He has not been productive. It is not a great matchup. That's pretty much the simple, short way of saying that. As far as kickers go, Matt Bryant. He's only missed 1 field goal attempt and he's only missed, struggling here. His only field goal attempt last week he missed. While he did make his PAT, he was struggling through a back injury. While he does seem to be healthy from that injury, he's not attempting a lot of field goals. He missed his only field goal attempt last week, and the Cardinals give up the 12th fewest fantasy points to kickers. Man, that was real easy for me to say. On the other side, Cardinals kicker Zane Gonzalez, he's kicked just 5 field goals all season. That's enough for me to say you should not trust him at this point. We just don't have enough volume to say that he's been a great kicker, that you can trust him. You should absolutely start Atlanta's defense, who give up the second most against the Cardinals, who give up the second most points to defenses, and you should sit the Cardinals. You should definitely sit them.
So look at the Lions versus the Bills. Start with quarterback Matthew Stafford versus the Bills, allowing the fewest points to quarterbacks there. Matthew Stafford has struggled since Week 8. The losses of Marvin Jones, Golden Tate, Kerryon Johnson have really crushed him after he started the season well. You need to sit this guy. Don't think twice about it. Sit Matthew Stafford. Once again, that Bills defense is underrated. They're playing on the road there. Josh Allen versus Detroit. So Detroit's allowing the 16th fewest points to quarterbacks. As far as throwing the ball goes, this guy's got a long way to go before he can become what I would call a quality quarterback in the NFL. Bills don't have great wide receivers. They don't have great weapons. They're well below average. But his athleticism is great. His legs make him a relevant fantasy player at this point. The last 3 games in rushing totals were 9 carries, 101 yards, 9 carries, 135 yards. He had 13 carries for 99 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. During that same stretch, he averaged 27.79 fantasy points per game. So there's potential there, but here's the thing. He's a rookie, so he's high risk, high reward. You could roll the dice, play this guy, and be a genius, or kick yourself in the rear that you took a chance on him in Week 15. How do you want to play that? So I'll tell you how I'll play it. I'm a guy that I just don't want to take that chance. I really don't. Unless you're really, really desperate, I'm going to look elsewhere. I think there's better options out there. Dak Prescott, some other guys are fairly highly available. Even Derek Carr, who's highly available, I'd rather roll with him than trust him. But once again, if you're in a pinch, he could do well for you. As far as running backs go, LaShawn McCoy, NFL's Ian Rappaport reports that LaShawn McCoy hamstring is day-to-day. An MRI apparently brought back positive news this week from it. With that said, right now they activated some guys from the practice squad. It looks like, I think, McCoy's going to sit in this one, but we'll have to watch and see. I think, once again, he's highly questionable at this point. Now, the Lions give up the 10th most points to running backs. If for some reason he were to play, obviously going to start McCoy. I think he's going to sit. And so that leaves a couple guys out there. It leaves Ivory. Now, if you look at Ivory, his value is only in standard leagues. And for me, it would be a low-end running back 3 play for me and Chris Ivory if he ends up suiting up and playing for McCoy. And the other guy that you consider out there is McKenzie. McKenzie's a guy that McCoy sits. Ivory's going to get the carries on first and second down. He's a big physical back. He's a bruising back. And then McKenzie's going to be your third down back, change of pace. They're using some gadget plays there. But he doesn't get enough touches, enough snaps to really trust at this point. So you could roll with Ivory in standard leagues as a running back 3. McKenzie, I would probably sit. Then I have Kerryon Johnson. He missed last week. He's got a knee injury. It's really hard to pin down what's going on. They've been pretty quiet. There's no indications where he's sitting for this week, but I would suspect he's going to miss another week. Why are you going to risk it in a game that means nothing when this is your future running back there? This guy looks like he's got a promising future in the NFL there. If by chance he returns, if Kerryon Johnson plays, he's a must-start versus the Bills, allowing the 9th most points to running backs. If he's out, that leaves 3 running backs to consider: Blunt, Zenner, and Riddick. So Blunt is a guy that you might want to start in standard leagues, but he's touchdown dependent. But here's the thing, he struggled all year. Take away that Thanksgiving Day performance that he hasn't been good. He's got a 2.9 yards per carry all year long. I would sit him. I wouldn't trust Blunt once again. I just think there's better options out there. Now, somebody could argue that Riddick has PPR value, but that offense is struggling. They're on the road against a decent defense, so Riddick, for me, even in PPR leagues, is nothing more than a running back 4. Zenner's a sleeper pick. He's a guy that had 12 carries last game, looked decent, had a touchdown. If Blunt were to miss the game for some reason, but I don't think he's going to, what's going to happen? It's going to be Blunt and Zenner splitting carries, going with a hot hand, devaluing each other, so I would just sit all those other backs. Once again, don't take your chances there. As far as wide receivers go, you got Kenny Galladay. He's the number 1 wide receiver for the Lions, but he's going to face a great shutdown corner in White. And with that Lions offense struggling on the road, cold weather against a tough cornerback, he's a wide receiver 4, sit. Then all other wide receivers I would sit. Buffalo wide receivers got Zay Jones or Robert Foster playing the Lions, allowing the 11th fewest points for wide receivers. Foster, in 3 of the last 4 games, he's been surprisingly good. But like I said earlier, Josh Allen is not a good quarterback. He's very athletic. He can run the ball, but he struggled throwing the ball. He's only got 5 touchdown passes in 9 games. During that stretch, averaging 158 passing yards per game. That is not good. Foster seems to be the wide receiver with the most upside. But do you pin your Week 15 hopes on a combination of Allen to Foster? I wouldn't do that. I would sit those guys. Sit tight ends on both teams. I would sit both kickers, and I would start both defenses. In fact, Detroit, kind of a sleeper play there. The Bills give the most points to defenses, so you could roll with the Detroit defense if you need to.
All right, now we have a nice divisional matchup between the Packers and the Bears. Starting off with Aaron Rodgers, I think that you should sit him. Of course, the Bears have been phenomenal. You guys saw what they did to the very potent Rams offense last week. It's no surprise to see that they give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. On top of that, Aaron Rodgers has struggled. He has thrown for 233 yards or less in 4 of the last 5 games, and so he has had a lot of struggle. You should sit him. On the other side, Mitchell Trubisky is another guy who should be sat. He's been held to 1 touchdown and 165 yards or less in 3 of his last 4 games. I think that's partly due to that Bears system, partly due maybe he's just not a great fantasy option. For whatever reason, I don't think that you should play him against a Packers team that gives up the 15th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. As far as running backs goes, it's a very interesting situation because Aaron Jones has been very hot lately. He has scored in 5 straight games, and in 6 of the last 7, he's been very productive, but he plays a Bears team that is 2nd best run defense in the NFL, allowing just 83.7 yards per game on the ground and gives up the 4th fewest points to running backs. If you do have to play Aaron Jones, it should be in a standard league only because he is touchdown dependent. He has much less value in a PPR league for sure. Now, if you're one of those people who have James Conner and Melvin Gordon and you're looking to buy more time, you don't have a great running back situation, Jordan Howard might be an option this week. While the Packers give up the 12th fewest fantasy points to running backs, Jordan Howard has been productive over the last 2 games. He has averaged 4.8 yards per carry twice, and he had over 100 rushing yards last week. On top of that, Green Bay's 24th ranked run defense is giving up 126 rushing yards per game. As far as the other running back in the offense goes, Tariq Cohen, I don't like him and I don't think that you should play him. While he's very specialized for PPR leagues, the production as a whole just hasn't been there. I think this is a game that the Bears are going to dominate the Packers, and I don't see them throwing the ball a lot. On top of that, the Packers give up the 12th fewest fantasy points to running backs, so I think that you should sit Cohen this week. Now we come to the wide receivers. Davante Adams is a guy that I think that you should start. He has scored in 3 straight games. In fact, he scored in all but 3 games this season. He has been very dominant. While the Bears have been a very good defense this year, they actually give up the 12th most fantasy points to wide receivers. For whatever reason that is, I think that you should absolutely start Davante Adams. Now we go to Randall Cobb. He scored for the first time since week 1 last week, and so that's very good for him. He's had at least 5 targets in each of his last 2 games since returning from injury. If you're desperate for a wide receiver this week, Randall Cobb is maybe a wide receiver 3. I certainly don't want to play him because that is a tough matchup. But if you're desperate, that might be an option. In my mind, he's more of a wide receiver 4. On the other side, we go to the Bears wide receivers. We talked about this lack of production from Mitchell Trubisky, throwing basically less than 165 yards in the last 4 of the last 5 games. That means I don't think that honestly you should start any wide receivers for the Bears. Allen Robinson has struggled despite getting so many targets. He's been held to 42 or less yards in 3 of the last 4 games. Taylor Gabriel, he has seen at least 7 targets in each of the Bears' last 4 games, but has not topped 52 yards in that span. And Anthony Miller, he wasn't even targeted last week. And so I think that that's a lot of reasons to just avoid all of those guys. The production simply hasn't been there. Jimmy Graham, as far as the tight ends go, goes against the Bears, give up the 9th fewest points to tight ends. Again, another guy where the production hasn't been there. He's been held to 55 or fewer yards in 7 straight games. 3 times going for 14 yards or less, so he is an absolute must-sit. Do not play him this week. Trey Burton, now he saw a bit of a uptick in usage this week with the return of Mitchell Trubisky, but the Packers do give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to tight ends. The tight end position is so thin. Certainly, some of you people out there will be playing Trey Burton this week, and I don't think he's an awful play, but I don't think he's a great play. I'd call him just middle-of-the-road average this week. As far as the kickers go, Mason Crosby, I think that you should sit him. Bears give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to kickers. On top of that, he's just struggled lately. We've seen a lot of the field goals that he's missed, and I don't think the Packers are going to be able to put up too many points on the board. Cody Parquet is a guy that I think that you should start. Coming off of his first missed field goal in 4 weeks, which is very good. He's averaged just 7.5 points during that same span. The Packers are the 17th ranked scoring defense that allows 23.6 points per game. So I imagine the Bears are going to be kicking lots of field goals. That should be a good play this week. You should sit the Packers, and you absolutely must, if you're smart, if you've made it this far, you've got to know to start the Bears. They're averaging 15 fantasy points a game over the last 6 games. They are very dominant. Absolutely start them.
Typically, the Raiders versus the Bengals. Let's start with Derek Carr versus Cincinnati, allowing the 3rd most points to quarterbacks. They are the worst defense in the NFL, allowing 30.5 points per game. They allow the most points per game in the NFL. That's 421 yards a game that they allow, to be exact. They've gotten worse as the years went on. The Bengals defense is atrocious at this point. Now, if you look at Derek Carr, he's been concerning all season. It's been hard to trust him at times. One, the Raiders have a lack of weapons there. Through his first 6 games, his touchdown to interception ratio, he had only 7 touchdown passes to 8 interceptions. That wasn't good. But since that week, he's went on to have 11 touchdown passes to 0 interceptions. He's quietly having a good year, especially when you consider the fact that the Raiders are rebuilding. They traded away his best wide receiver, Amari Cooper. He's got his best quarterback rating of his career this year at 97.2, and it's going up and up each week. His 11 touchdown passes in the last 4 games has been great. Like I said, not throwing an interception there. And this is a great matchup. All year long, I've had a hard time trusting Derek Carr, but I think in this one, you can trust him. I think he's a very good play. As far as quarterback Jeff Driscoll goes, a quarterback for the Bengals, the Raiders give up the 6th most points to quarterbacks there, but in 3 games he's averaging just 1 touchdown pass per game and 187 yards. On top of that, A.J. Green is out. Even in a good matchup, you need to sit Driscoll in this one. As far as running backs go, you got Joe Mixon. The Raiders allow the 11th most points to running backs there. Even in tough matchups, Joe Mixon has been very good all season. His yards per carry at 4.8 is very good. He adds to that, he's also great in the passing game at 38 catches. He's averaged over 100 total yards per game all year long. He's a high-end running back 1 in this one. Start him. As far as the running backs go for the Raiders go, you have Doug Martin and Jalen Richard. So Cincinnati allows the most points to running backs. Now, Martin, I think, is going to get a lot of carries in this game. 7 weeks in a row, he's had double-digit carries. During the same 7-week stretch, he's averaged 13 carries, 54 yards. In the last 3 weeks, he's had a touchdown. So I think he's a good play in standard leagues. I do think Martin loses some value in PPR leagues. Speaking of PPR leagues, look at Jalen. Jalen Richard, very good in the passing game. Got 57 catches on the year. He's a very similar back to a back that the Bengals faced last week in terms of size, skill set, things like that, and that was Austin Eckler. Austin Eckler had a very good game versus them. 15 carries, 66 yards, 4.4 yards per carry, 2 catches, 28 yards, and a touchdown. I think Richard's going to have a similar game, probably less carries, but more catches and targets, so I would definitely roll with him. As far as wide receivers go, we got Tyler Boyd. The Raiders give up the 9th fewest points to wide receivers. Added that Driscoll at this point of his career is not a very good quarterback, so that lowers Boyd's value. He is a wide receiver 3, even though he's had a very good year. John Ross. Now in 4 games that Green has been out, he's got touchdowns in those 4 games. But he's got low catches and low yards, so to me he's nothing more than wide receiver 5. Jordy Nelson. Cincinnati's the worst defense in the NFL, like I previously mentioned. But statistically, they're not as bad versus wide receivers. They're only allowing the 14th most points to wide receivers, so they would appear to be better against wide receivers. But here's why. What's happening is a lot of times they've been blown out by opposing teams who in the second half don't need to throw the ball a lot. They run the ball more, giving the impression that they're decent towards wide receivers, but in reality they're just as bad against wide receivers as they are in other areas defensively. And you look at the fact that Derek Carr is playing well, Jordy Nelson is healthy again. Suddenly Jordy Nelson has value there. 2 weeks ago he had 10 catches, 97 yards. He followed it up last week with 6 catches for 48 yards. He had a stretch earlier this season in 3 games where he had a touchdown in those games, and he had 1 game where he had 6 catches, 173 yards and a touchdown. This is a guy that can still be productive. This is a great matchup for him. He's trending up. I would safely start him as a wide receiver 3. I would sit all other Raiders wide receivers. As far as tight ends go, you got Jared Cook playing the Bengals. The Bengals allow the 12th most points to tight ends there. Cook has been Carr's best weapon and the most reliable wide receiver, or receiver I should say, this season. He's already set career highs in yards, catches, and touchdowns with 3 games to go there. I can't get my fingers right. 3 to go, whatever
Something
that is.
like that.
3 to go. Anyways, 4 times this season he's had over 100 receiving yards. Last 2 games he's had 100 receiving yards. So I would start Cook as a high-end tight end too. He is the 6th overall tight end ranked this week. And so once again, look at tight end rankings. Right now this week, he's number 6 tight end. I love Jared Cook in this matchup. I would sit the tight ends for Cincinnati, even CJ. If you look at the matchups, he's had great matchups. He's underperformed. Stay away from him. I would start kicker Carlson. I would sit Bullock, and I would sit both defenses.
All right, Colts versus Cowboys. Now, Dak Prescott absolutely exploded last week, as you talked about a little bit earlier, that he could certainly be a good option this week. He had 455 passing yards and 3 touchdowns, and he looked very good. However, that was his first 300-plus yard passing game of the season. Of course, much of that was due to the fact that for the first half of the year, he didn't have a good wideout. Finally, Amari Cooper came in, and things have really been turning around for him. While the Colts do give the 14th fewest points to quarterbacks, I think that number's a bit deceiving, and I do like Dak Prescott this week. He's not an amazing option, but if you're in a larger league where quarterbacks are somewhat hard to come by, Dak Prescott can be played this week. On the other side, Andrew Luck is a guy you should play this week. He threw for 399 yards and 2 touchdowns last week in a road win against Houston's defense that has been playing much, much better lately. In fact, we've been talking about them lately, about how good they've played, so I was very surprised to see how well he went into Houston in a road game against a good team and played, so I definitely like him in this matchup as well. Not to mention, he had an 8-game stretch this season where 8 games in a row he had at least 3 passing touchdowns. Andrew Luck has been insane this year. I think you should play him this week if you have him. As far as the running backs go, let's save ourselves some time and make the obvious choice of saying let's start Ezekiel Elliott. He's been insane. His numbers are awesome. As far as the other side goes, though, for running backs, Marlon Mack is an interesting situation, and I don't necessarily think that you should play him. The Cowboys give up the 5th fewest points to running backs, and he has gained just 60 yards combined over the past 2 weeks. He did not score last week, or excuse me, he did score last week. But I don't think that this is an offense that loves to run the ball with him a whole lot. Of course, Naheem Hines is there as well. He does a lot in the passing game. Mack has a little bit of value. I like him for the future. In fact, I think he's a good running back. But as far as this game goes, he doesn't have a lot of value. I don't think you should play him. Of course, Amari Cooper, man, you got to start Amari Cooper. Man, he's been insane. Last game he had 217 yards and 3 touchdowns. 3 weeks ago he had 180 yards and 2 touchdowns. I mean, any wideout who's got 5 touchdowns in 3 weeks and, you know, over 300, 400 yards is insane. You got to start him. He's been on fire. T.Y. Hilton is another wide receiver that you should start. He crossed the 100 receiving yard mark for the 3rd time in the last 4 weeks. He is a great option with a great quarterback as well. However, other than Hilton and Cooper, I don't think you should play any of the other wide receivers in this matchup. Guys, you absolutely have to start Eric Ebron at the tight end position. He's got 12 touchdowns all year, and it's nice to see that Jack Doyle is out. That'll give him a lot of value this week. You should sit all Dallas tight ends for sure. As far as the kickers go, Brett Maher, I think that you should play him. He had a nice 62-yard field goal last week, and he's made multiple field goals in 4 of the last 5 games. And on top of that, he has a good matchup against a team that gives up the 5th most points to kickers. You should sit kicker Adam Vinatieri. He hasn't been a great option this week, and he has a tough matchup. As far as the defenses go, the Colts are tempting because the Cowboys give up the 13th most points to opposing defenses. They've got 14 sacks in the last 5 games, but other than that, they're really just okay. I don't think they're an amazing option, and I think that you can find some better streams this week. I also think that you should sit the Cowboys. They've been a great defense, but not a great fantasy defense. In fact, only twice this year have they topped 10 fantasy points, so I think you should sit both defenses.
Talk about the Dolphins versus the Vikings. I'm a Vikings fan. Need to call this game a must-win for the Vikings. Although you look at Miami right now, they're also competing for a wild card spot there. Let's start with the quarterbacks. Ryan Tannehill versus the Vikings, allowing the 8th fewest points to quarterbacks. Now Ryan, since returning from an injury, he's looked decent. Has 8 touchdown passes to only 1 interception. Although one of those touchdowns was on a fluke play at the end of the game there, obviously. If you look at the Vikings versus the last 6 quarterbacks they've faced, listen to the names here. Listen to these guys, okay? Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Trubisky, Rodgers, Wilson, and Stafford. Those 6 quarterbacks, I mean, they're not slouches by any stretch. These are quality quarterbacks. They're averaging less than 11 points per game versus the Vikings in fantasy. They have struggled. And now you're looking at Ryan Tannehill. I would sit him versus the Vikings. That Vikings defense. The Vikings team has had struggles, but that defense has not been an issue for them. They played very well. Kirk Cousins having a decent season, but the last 2 games he struggled. In fact, that offense struggled so much the last 2 games, they fired their offensive coordinator this week. Versus Miami, allowing the 14th most points to quarterbacks. Now, he's had some recent struggles, Kirk Cousins has, but he's still on pace for 30 touchdown passes this year. He's got 2 great wide receivers in Thielen and Diggs. It's really hard to ignore that talent there. He also had Dalvin Cook, who's shown he's very effective in the passing game. So I look at Kirk Cousins. I think he's a fair start this week. He's not a top 10 quarterback, but I think he's a quality play. I think he will rebound with a nice week there playing at home. Got running backs Frank Gore. Minnesota allows the 10th fewest points to running backs. Now, he's going to get double-digit carries. He's been doing that all year. They keep feeding him the ball, and he's performed fairly well. The guy's 35 years old. He's had an amazing year. I love Frank Gore. But the Vikings is a good defense, and his role in that passing game is almost non-existent, which gives him only value in standards. For this reason, I would sit him this week. Then you have Kenyon Drake. He's got 9 touchdowns on the year. He's got 41 catches. When he touches the ball, when they give him targets and carries, he's explosive. But for whatever reason, Miami's hesitant to commit to this guy. They're committed to getting Gore the ball. And that lowers Drake's value, making him hard to trust from week to week. He just doesn't get the volume. But once again, 9 touchdowns on the year is pretty solid, and 41 catches, what gives him higher value in PPR leagues. It is a road game against a good Minnesota defense. I would sit him in standards, but if you're on PPR leagues, I would consider him a flex play. Dalvin Cook plays Miami, allowing the 7th most points to running backs. He's been used extensively in the passing game. He's shown burst in the running game. Looks like he's recovered from that injury. He's a running back 2 in this matchup. Hopefully they'll stick to the run long enough. I think he's a guy that if you get 15 carries could easily break 100 yards. Hopefully Minnesota will make that adjustment. As far as wide receivers go, you got Diggs and Thielen versus Miami, allowing the 16th fewest points to wide receivers. Adam Thielen is a wide receiver 1 weekly. It doesn't matter. Just go ahead and play him. And then Diggs. Stephon Diggs, when healthy, is very talented wide receiver. He's a wide receiver 2. He's already set career highs in yards and catches. I would sit all Miami wide receivers in this one. They face Minnesota, allowing the 5th fewest points to wide receivers. Avoid them. As far as tight ends go, Kyle Rudolph, we said in the preseason that he was overrated. Boy, we didn't realize how overrated this guy was. He is very underperformed this year and disappointed to sit him. I would sit the Miami tight ends. I would sit both kickers, start the Minnesota defense, and start the Miami defense in this one. I'm sorry, correction there. I would start the Minnesota defense, and I would sit the Miami defense in this one. So there you go.
All right, here we come to the Titans versus the Giants, and this is actually a fairly simple game as far as your start-sit implications go. For starters, Eli Manning and Marcus Mariota are both going to get sit. They both have matchup against top 10 teams as far as allowing the fewest points to quarterbacks, and they just haven't performed great lately. I wouldn't put either of them in at this point in the season. Of course, simple thing right here. You're going to start Saquon Barkley. The guy's been insane. He's at least 100 rushing yards and a touchdown in 4 straight games. He is the heart of that offense. He's been insane. Gets a little bit tricky when you go to the Titans running backs. Derrick Henry's played great. Now the Giants give up the 8th most points to running backs. He exploded last week for 283 yards and 4 touchdowns. He's been insane. I will say this. It does help that he has had more carries than Dion Lewis for 2 weeks straight. However, I do not trust him. He is a touchdown machine, and in a standard league, if you're looking for a 1-week option, again, if you're one of those teams that's struggling at running back because you had Kareem Hunt or Melvin Gordon or James Conner, he might be a guy to put in, but he is such a risky play. I don't think that you can trust him, but he's got so much upside. In fact, he has scored 4 times last week, and he's had 9 touchdowns for Tennessee over the last 7 weeks. He has been super productive as far as that goes, and the Giants have the 22nd ranked run defense in the NFL right now. But I cannot emphasize enough, he has struggled all year long. He is touchdown dependent. Do not feel comfortable with him. Only play him if you have to. I know that a lot of people are excited about him, but luckily we did put that poll up on our community tab, and most people agreed with us that he doesn't seem to be the real deal, and we don't think that he's a long-term option. Dion Lewis should be sat. He is slowly losing carries and losing starting time to Derrick Henry, and he just hasn't been performing great. As far as the wide receivers go, Odell Beckham is struggling with some quad issues. However, it looks like he should play, and if he does play, you got to start the guy. He's got 4 touchdowns in 4 weeks. Sterling Shepard is a guy that you should play if Odell Beckham is out. And if Odell Beckham plays, then you should not play Shepard. Shepard only has value if Beckham is out. It is important to note that the Titans give up the 9th most points to wide receivers. As far as the Titans wide receivers go, the only one really worth mentioning is Corey Davis. Now the Giants give up the 9th fewest points to wide receivers, so that already does not bode well for him. He hasn't had amazing production. His 2-game touchdown streak was ended last week, and he hasn't been amazing, but the Giants do have the 19th ranked pass defense. If you are looking desperately for a wide receiver, I still wouldn't go towards Corey Davis, to be honest with you. The production hasn't been there, and I don't trust his quarterback or that offense. As far as the tight ends go, you should sit all tight ends for the Titans. I don't trust that situation at all there with the way that things are going. And then as far as Evan Ingram goes, the Titans give up the fewest points to tight ends. And so that does not bode well for him. He did have 77 yards last week, and he played well after coming back from his absence from missing due to injury or whatever. But I don't necessarily trust him in this matchup. The tight end position is so thin that I know that if you probably have him, he's probably your best option this week, and I understand that. But certainly keep your expectations very low. He does have added value if Odell Beckham doesn't play, but Beckham should play. That I really expect that to happen. As far as the kickers go, Aldrick Rosas, he's made multiple field goals in 3 straight games for the Giants, and goes against a Titans team that allows just 19.5 points per game, which is actually 4th best in the NFL. I think that Rosas is an average play this week. I imagine that the Giants could kick a lot of field goals because of that. Now Ryan Suckup kicking for the Titans, I think he's got a good matchup. The Giants give up the most points to kickers, but that offense is so bad, it's really hard to tell what to say. The matchup is so good, it's hard to ignore, but that offense is so bad that is equally hard to ignore. However, the Giants are against kickers are giving up just 9.9 points per game, which is actually pretty good. That's average. And so if you're looking for a 1-week play this week, Suckup is okay, not great. The Giants, you should start the Giants defense. They've been great. They've gotten 10 sacks in the last 2 games, and I believe that they've had 6 turnovers and even a touchdown. In fact, they've had 3 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. You should play that Giants defense, and you should sit the Titans.
Talk about the Redskins versus the Jags. Start with quarterback Cody Kessler. 1 touchdown pass in 2 games. No matter how you spin this, you need to sit this guy. Bad offense. When that team wants to win the ball, running the ball and playing defense once again, there's nothing there to trust. Stay away from Cody Kessler, the quarterback for the Jags. Then you got Josh Johnson, quarterback for the Redskins. So last week he comes in versus the Giants. The Giants were blowing them out, and he's facing the second-string defensive players. He comes in, he was productive. He got some points there, some garbage time stats, look good. Don't be deceived, okay? Don't get excited about how he finished and think that's going to somehow be a sneaky pick or a sleeper play for you. Before that game, he hadn't played in the NFL. You have to go all the way back to 2012 to where he played a game. He has a career quarterback rating of 61. There's a reason why he wasn't on a team's roster, okay? I'm glad he got to call it up. I'm glad he got to play a great start. With that said, you can't trust this guy. It speaks volumes of the fact that it took an injury to Smith and McCoy and Sanchez being brutal before he finally got an opportunity. The Jaguars, for all of their struggles, still have a very good defense. A defense that 2 weeks ago shut down Andrew Luck, who going into that game was extremely hot. They give the second fewest points to quarterbacks. Stay away from Josh Johnson. Don't get cute. As far as running backs go, you got Adrian Peterson. That Redskins offensive line is missing some key players with injuries. Josh Johnson is going to be starting, which means if you're an opposing defense, what are you going to do, Christian? You're facing the Redskins. Josh Johnson's quarterback.
Load the box.
You're going to load the box, right? Like, you're going to shut down Adrian Peterson and force Josh to throw the ball. It is going to be tough yards for Adrian Peterson. Since week 9, since those injuries started piling up for that offensive line, if you take away a 90-yard run out of there, okay, from week 9, he's at a total of 185 total yards rushing on 64 carries for 3.05 yards per carry. He has really struggled with that offensive line beat up, injuries to quarterbacks. Playing the Jags, allowing the 8th fewest points to running backs there. I would sit Adrian Peterson and Chris Thompson. Leonard Fournette. Skins are middle of the road in terms of points allowed to quarterbacks. I would start him as a running back 2 this week, although things are going to be tough because the same thing in reverse. Kessler playing quarterback. I would imagine the Redskins are going to load the box and force him to throw the ball, which means that for Leonard Fournette it would be tough. With that said, even if the yards are tough, he's a good volume play. Weeks 10 through 12 there, the team has showed they were committed to him. He averaged over 96 total yards per game. He had 5 touchdowns and 12 catches during a 4-game span. Once again, they're going to make sure he gets the ball quite a bit there. As far as wide receivers go, I would sit all Redskins wide receivers. They're facing the Jags, Jalen Ramsey, Josh Johnson's at quarterback. Just too risky, stay away. As far as wide receivers for the Jags go, I got Dede Westbrook and Moncrief. If you had to go with the guy, it'd be Dede Westbrook. But I think that for me, he lands as a wide receiver 4. It's best to sit him. As far as tight ends go, Jordan Reed is doubtful for this one. That means Vernon Davis is worth a flyer if you're desperate. We talked about how that position is very thin there, so he could be a desperate play, though he's not a great play. He's out of the top 10 for sure. Sit the Jags tight ends. I would sit both kickers and start the Jaguars defense. Now, the Skins defense is an okay play. The one concern I have is this. A lot of times, defense's value is connected to their team's offense. If the Skins can't move the ball and score points, that means the Jaguars' offense can play conservatively, run the ball, not take chances, which takes away value from that Skins defense. So they've got a good matchup, and they're an okay play, but they're not a great play.
All right, here we are in the Ravens versus Buccaneers. And while the Ravens do give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, I still think you should start Jameis Winston. He's had multiple touchdowns in each of the last 4 games. His production has been insane. I mean, he's averaging like, what, 25, almost 25 fantasy points per game when he starts the whole game. It's been insane. Now, one thing I want to note is that defense is very good, so you should absolutely lower your expectations on what Jameis Winston's going to do. But that offense has so many weapons for him to throw to, and the running game is so weak that they lean on him to throw the ball and be so productive. They don't think he's going to have an amazing day, and I definitely like the Ravens defense. I still think that Jameis Winston's going to have some fantasy points. He's going to have an okay day simply by volume and the fact that they ask him to do so much. If any points are put up by that offense, it's going to be Jameis Winston in the passing game for sure. On the other side, Joe Flacco and Lamar Jackson, we've talked about it for weeks. You shouldn't trust or start either of them. In fact, reports are that they're going to be splitting time. That's awful. That should not happen. That is gross. We talk about how bad running back by committee systems are. Quarterback by committee systems, probably the worst position to be splitting time between multiple players for sure. So don't play either of them. As far as the running backs go, I think that you should be sitting Peyton Barber. Now, Peyton Barber goes against the Ravens, who give up the fewest points to running backs, and he's a guy who hasn't had a whole lot of yards per carry. He doesn't do much in the passing game. He hasn't been a great option, really. The only time he's a good option is if he scores a touchdown that week, and I really don't think that you can trust him. Gus Edwards, however, is a guy that I think you can trust. Tampa Bay gives up the 5th most points to running backs, and he's been really the lead running back in that offense, and so I like him for that. In fact, I think that he is much more of a standard play to note. He doesn't have a lot of PPR value, but I think he's safe because of the way that offense runs. They're just going to run the ball and play defense, and he's going to get his value in volume. Now, I do want to mention Kenneth Dixon because he's been on the rise a little bit lately. While he does have 2 touchdowns in the last 2 games and has kind of increased his role a little bit, he was injured for much of the year and he really lost that job. You can't trust him, but his role is going to increase a little bit, and that will certainly take slightly away from running back Gus Edwards. As far as the wide receivers go, you got to start Mike Evans. It's a tough matchup against the Ravens, give the 4th fewest points to wide receivers, but he's been so productive. He's on pace for almost 1,500 yards this year. I mean, how can you not play this guy? Sure, I don't think he's going to be a wide receiver 1 this week, but a wide receiver 2 or 3, for sure, yes, he should be started. While we've talked a lot lately about wide receiver Adam Humphries, I don't think that you should play him. Of course, he does have 5 touchdowns in the last 6 games. That is very touchdown dependent. He hasn't had more than 50 or 60 yards basically all season. He's very much struggled. And again, mentioned how tough that Ravens defense is, giving the 4th fewest points to wide receivers. You should sit all Ravens wide receivers. I don't think we need to talk about how bad they've been. And I feel like every video, this would be the 10th video in the row where we just discuss that they're not catching the ball, getting targeted, or finding the end zone. It's important to note that since Lamar Jackson has taken over, their production has dropped even further. You should sit all Ravens tight ends. They just haven't been productive, and they're really kind of competing for which of those 3 guys gets the most snaps, but none of them have really been great. Cameron Brate is a guy that you should play if you're looking for an option this week. Again, the tight end position is so thin. The Ravens give up the 7th most points to tight ends, and he has scored 2 touchdowns. He scored 2 touchdowns in last week's loss to the Saints, so he's been very productive lately. I definitely like him for that. I think you got to start kicker Justin Tucker and sit kicker Cairo Santos. Excuse me. I think you should start the Ravens defense and sit Tampa Bay.
Let's talk about Seattle versus the 49ers. Let's start with quarterback Nick Mullins. Now, if you look at the Seahawks, they give the 8th fewest points to quarterbacks there. Nick has been a nice surprise. In 5 starts, he's had 3 very good outcomes. In fact, 1 was against the Seahawks. Now, last 2 weeks against Denver and Seattle, he's averaging 2 touchdown passes per game and averaging 373 passing yards per game. He's trending up. He looks really good there. But another team that's trending up is Seattle. Winners of 4 straight games there. And so if you look at that Seattle team, they've done quite a bit. When you consider how many players they lost on defense, they've surprisingly done well. But since week 8, they do give up a lot of points to quarterbacks in fantasy. And so everything on paper, all the numbers seem to indicate that Nick Mullins is a decent play. With that said, if I was you, I wouldn't trust my week 15 to Nick Mullins playing a Seattle team that's hungry and playing really well right now. I would lean towards sitting him. Then you have Russell Wilson. In 8 games before facing the Vikings, he had 22 touchdown passes and only 2 interceptions. The Vikings defense is very, very good. He's going to rebound and be just fine this week. Start him. As far as running backs go, we have Matt Breida. He has an ankle injury. He could be back this week. We suspect from all reports that he's probably going to miss 1 more week there. And the reason why is Jeff Wilson's playing well. Why rush him back? They play Seattle on the 12th most points to running backs. Now, if you look at Wilson over the last 2 games, he's averaged over 115 total yards per game last 2 games. He's been very good. I would start him if Breida sits as a running back too. I think he has higher value in PPR leagues, lower value in standards. As far as Chris Carson goes, he plays San Francisco, allowing the 16th fewest points to running backs. Seattle is committed to running the ball a ton. They use Davis, they use Penny, so and so. For all that, even though Chris Carson has been good, he's big, he's physical, I like him. He does fall into that what I would call kind of mid-range running back too. I wish he had a few more carries. They're a little more committed to just him, but they do spread the ball around there. Then you'll have Penny and Davis. They both have played well this year. But with Carson hogging the carries, they can't be trusted weekly. It would take an injury to either Davis or to Carson or Penny or to one of them before the other guys would have value. I would sit those guys. As far as wide receivers go, San Francisco, Dante Pettis. That rookie wide receiver is their best wide receiver already on that team. It's clear if you watch those games, he's the best wide receiver that they have. Got 5 touchdowns on the year. He's really blossomed in that role when he's been able to start with Garcon and Goodwin out. Now Goodwin is back. Now, in the last 3 games, he's had 4 touchdowns. The same last 3 games, he had 12 catches and 255 total yards. He torched Seattle 2 games ago for 5 catches, 129 yards, and 2 TDs. He's a high-end wide receiver 3 this week versus Seattle allowing the 13th most points to wide receivers. As far as Goodwin goes, he's a boomer bust player who's touchdown dependent. I would sit him. Tyler Lockett, 9 touchdowns on the year. He's also set career highs in yards. Playing San Francisco, allowing the 11th most points to wide receivers. I would start him as a wide receiver 3. He's got more value in standards, less in PPR leagues. Then there's Doug Baldwin. Doug Baldwin missed Monday's game. He's been banged up all year. He's a mess physically. But if he plays, I would start him as a wide receiver 3 in PPRs. I would sit him in standard. So watch your reports for Doug Baldwin. As far as tight ends go, you got George Kittle. We liked this guy in the preseason. We previewed him, said he had a lot of talent. He'd feel good. This guy has arrived. He is a rising star that's already here. He's as good as Kelsey, Ertz, and Gronk. You need to start him. He's great. I know you tried to trade for him in our keeper league. I forgot to tell you got turned down on that trade offer. Sorry.
Oh, well.
But the guy's got a ton of talent. You got to like George Kittle. I would sit the tight ends for Seattle. I would start Janikowski. I would sit Gould. And I would start Seattle's defense, but I would sit San Francisco's defense.
All right, now Patriots versus the Steelers. Ben Roethlisberger is a guy you should start. Now, he did miss a significant portion of last game due to an injury. However, reports are that he's going to play, that he seems fine, that he's healthy. I believe he's not even marked as questionable currently. And so that's good. In fact, despite missing time, he had 282 yards and 2 touchdowns. Patriots give it the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, so I absolutely think that you should start Ben Roethlisberger this week, unless news comes out or something comes out to change our minds on that. However, right now, the way things are. Tom Brady is another guy you should start. He's a bit more of a low-end starter, that quarterback, in that 12 range, barely getting to that top sort of guys there, because Steelers give the 11th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, but he's been good for the second straight week. He's had over 300 yards, and he added 3 touchdowns last week. And so what's really been a struggling season for him, he's finally started to turn it around. I think that he's a fairly good option this week, but not an amazing one. As far as the running backs goes, Jalen Samuels. This is an interesting situation. Like we expected, he was the main ball carrier, the main running back in that offense for the Steelers, and that certainly did help him out quite a bit. You can really see why he has looked like he was going to play running back, but also he's going to play tight end. Like, he did so much more in the passing game, and he's got a lot of extra value in a PPR league. In fact, in a standard league, I'm really not a huge fan of him, but in a PPR league, I think you got to put him in at your flex or maybe at a running back too. Patriots do give up the 13th most points to running backs, and so that does bode very well for him. Now, as far as the New England running backs go, it's a very sketchy situation with Rex Burkett coming back in and getting some carries and performing well. James White kind of being the receiving running back, and Sony Michel being the guy that at least we expect to be the best running back, the main running back in that offense, but barely. And then on top of the fact that the Steelers give up the 7th least fantasy points to running backs, I honestly don't trust any New England running backs this week. However, I understand that some of you guys are going to want to play some of these guys, so here just some information. If you still want to play James White in a PPR league, note that he caught just 2 passes last week in a game against the Dolphins. That should have been a fairly easy matchup for him, and Sony Michel struggled against the bottom 5 defense in the NFL as far as the run goes. In fact, again, like I mentioned, he faces a much tougher run defense this week, so I don't trust any of them, especially when you talk about how they're bringing some 3rd and even 4th running back in for goal line carries. It's just such a weird situation for them. That is the epitome of a running back by committee system that cannot be trusted. Of course, Antonio Brown, you got to play him. He has been so productive this season. You're not going to sit Antonio Brown. And kind of the same goes for Juju Smith-Schuster. Despite the fact they struggled, he had his 8th game with over 100 receiving yards last year, and goes up against a team that gives the 13th fewest points to wide receivers. But either way, you should start Antonio Brown, who is a good wide receiver 1, and Schuster, who is a good wide receiver 2. As far as the Patriots go, I'm not a huge fan of any of their wide receivers. Julian Edelman, he saw team-high targets with 12 targets last week and 9 receptions. He finished with 86 yards and a touchdown. He, to me, seems to be the best fantasy option as far as receivers go there, but he's still not great. Again, 15th, goes against a team that gives the 15th fewest points to wide receivers. And Josh Gordon, he's been consistent this year, nearly broke the 100-yard receiving mark last week, but he didn't quite do it, and he didn't find the end zone. So That's kind of where that goes. Of those two guys, I like Edelman more. As far as the tight ends go, I think that you should sit Vance McDonald. He does have to compete with Jesse James for targets every single week. However, the Patriots do give the 4th most points to tight ends, so that bodes well, but there's so many weapons in that offense. I think you should start Gronkowski. He's been playing better. Last week he had 100 yards. He's been playing much gooder. He's been playing much better, and the Steelers give up the 5th most points to tight ends. He's really struggled this year, but since he's came back, he's been healthy the last 2 games, or in the last couple of games, he's had 2 games that were very productive. As far as the kickers go, I think that you should sit kicker Stephen Gostkowski and you should start Chris Boswell. As far as the defenses go, I think that you should actually sit both of them.
Talk at the Eagles versus the Rams. I'm going to start with Carson Wentz. I'm going to give you my breakdown. Then I'm going to give you some recent information that just came out today. Start with Carson Wentz. He laid an egg versus the Saints, right? But other than that one game, he's had 21 touchdown passes, only 4 interceptions. He's having his best season quietly, his best quarterback rating, his most passing yards per game. The development of Dallas Goedert at tight end and Golden Tate are huge for that offense. Plays at Ramla on the 15th most points to quarterbacks, so I would say start him. But today reports came out that he might miss the game because of back spasms. In fact, there's been conversation that he could be done for the year. So you got to watch that one. Obviously, if he plays, I would start him. If not, it's going to be Nick Foles. Nick Foles was brutal early in the year. If it's Nick Foles, I would sit Nick Foles. Jared Goff plays in Philadelphia, allowing the 9th most points to quarterbacks. Dak Prescott just went ballistic on Philly last week, 455 passing yards. Goff is having a very good year. Now, last week he did throw 4 interceptions versus the Bears defense. That's the best defense in the NFL. He's going to rebound and be just fine. Don't worry about it. Start Jared Goff. Start Todd Gurley. He's going to have a huge week against Philadelphia there. Don't worry about that. And then you got Adams running back for Philadelphia. It's very much like the Aaron Jones situation. They really need to stick with this guy and get him carries. When they do, he's been productive. Last game he had 7 carries, 36 yards, 5.1 yards per carry. But they're just not getting him the touches. Although now Corey Clement did go on the IR, so that might solidify his carries and help him be productive as they would call a low play running back too. Though I will say this, if it's Wentz on the bench and Foles starting, then I would just bench Adams. Now he's playing the Rams, allowing the 12 fewest points to running backs. You got Smallwood and Sproles in this one. Now Sproles had touchdowns on back-to-back weeks, but his value is only in PPR leagues. And I don't think his touches are high enough to trust. At 35 years of age, they're not going to give him a lot of touches or carries. He's going to have a very selective role in that offense, so I wouldn't trust Smallwood or Sproles in that, especially would not trust him if Nick Foles is starting. Alshon Jeffrey, he's had 5 good games and 5 bad games. It's kind of rolling the dice with him. Now he's a touchdown-dependent wide receiver in standard leagues. The Rams allow the 15th fewest points to wide receivers. In larger leagues, I would say that he's a wide receiver 3. But once again, going back to what I just said, if it's Nick Foles, I would just sit him. In fact, if it's Nick Foles, at this point, I wouldn't really trust anybody from that offense. He was so bad early in this year. Golden Tate, since the trades, had 4 bad games to 1 good game. I would sit him no matter who the quarterback is. As far as the wide receivers go for the Rams, you got Brandon Cooks. Philadelphia allows the 2nd most points to wide receivers. I would start him and Robert Woods. They are both wide receiver 2s this week. As far as tight ends go, Zach Ertz is the 2nd best tight end in football. I love Travis Kelce. Start Zach Ertz. Sit the Rams tight ends. I would start Greg Zuerlein, and I would start Elliott if Wentz goes. If it's Foles, once again, I would sit Elliott. Start the Rams defense, which looks even better now if it's Nick Foles, but it doesn't matter. I would still start the Rams defense no matter who plays, and I would sit Philadelphia's defense.
All right, so here we are in the last matchup we're going to talk about for this week, and that's the Saints-Panthers. Now, Rob just had to take off and go do something, kind of just came up last minute, and so I'll just be here for this last thing, but it should be pretty quick. Now, like Cam Newton this week, he's a good start. The Saints give up the 3rd most points to quarterbacks, and he's 1 week removed from an 11-game streak of having multiple touchdowns. So I think Cam Newton is a very good start, especially against a potent offense. Now, speaking of potent offenses, a lot of people are a bit nervous about Drew Brees. In fact, in the last 3 weeks, he has been held to 201 or fewer passing yards, and so I think a lot of people are nervous. However, He still played great. Carolina is the 20th ranked pass defense and gives up the 7th most points to quarterbacks as far as fantasy goes. And so I think that that is a great matchup. On top of that is a Monday night matchup, which bodes very well, gives some extra time for the Saints to figure out whatever's been going on in that offense. I don't think that he is the #1 quarterback I might be excited to play this week, but he is a good quarterback and you should play him. Of course, Saints give up the 2nd fewest points to running backs, so some people are nervous about McCaffrey, but you have to play McCaffrey. He has 12 touchdowns in the past 7 games, and in the past 3 games, he's averaging 33 fantasy points per game. He's been on fire. Over the last 3 games, he's the best fantasy running back. You have to play him, guys. I think you should also play Alvin Kamara, but you should limit your expectations just a little bit and understand that Carolina gives up the 6th fewest points to running backs. He hasn't been amazing over this stretch as that offense has struggled, but as I've said, I still trust him. He's averaging 11 fantasy points per game over the last 3 games. That should pick up again with the extra time to figure things out. Mark Ingram, he's going to split some carries. He's going to take a little bit of value away. Again, that's one thing that's really always hurt them, is that they both take value away from each other and how they're playing. However, he's just averaging 7 fantasy points per game over the last 3 games. That should increase a little bit. I think that you should start Alvin Kamara as a running back too, and I don't know if you should start Mark Ingram unless you really need to find an option this week. He's maybe a flex player or running back 2 at best. As far as the wide receivers go, make this one short and simple. You got to start Michael Thomas. Goes up against a team that gives it the 7th most points to wide receivers, and he's just been insane this year. He's been on fire. The only wide receiver worth mentioning for Carolina is DJ Moore. He has 359 receiving yards over the past 4 weeks. He's going to have a good matchup against a team that gives up the single most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. He is going to take advantage of that, and I think he's going to have a very good day. I think you should start DJ Moore as a wide receiver too. As far as the tight ends go, you should sit both tight ends, Dan Arnold and Ian Thomas. We haven't seen enough from these guys to trust either of them. Ian Thomas has a tough matchup this week, and Arnold has an easy matchup, but he only has 150 yards and a touchdown all season, so you should sit both of them. You should start kicker Will Lutz, and you should sit Chandler Catanzaro. He's got a very tough matchup against a team that gives up the fewest points to kickers. As far as the defenses go, I think that you should start the Saints. They have 17 sacks and 7 turnovers in just the last 3 games, and I think that you should sit the Panthers against the Saints, who give up the fewest points to defenses and also have been averaging just 3.4 fantasy points per game over the last 5 games. Again, I spoke a little faster, so you should start the Saints and sit the Panthers defense. Guys, as always, we try to cover as much as we can, but this video is over an hour long, and there is so much information in it that we do cut some things out. So if there's something cut out that you absolutely need to know about, that's what the comment section is down below there for. And of course, we don't post videos every day, so that's what we love to do. Days we're not posting, we're hopping on there answering questions. I understand that we missed a couple of questions last week, and I apologize for that. I don't know what happened. Essentially, we just pull up all of our questions, go from oldest to newest, and answer all of them. May have just accidentally scrolled past a few. We apologize for that. Guys, as always, thank you so much for watching. You guys have a great day, and God bless.